What is up, everybody? This is mostly a Detroit sports channel, but in this video, I want to talk about stats that affect a team's record. We'll be going over passing yards, rushing yards, pass attempts, rush attempts, sacks allowed, takeaways, non-offensive touchdowns, time of possession, and points allowed. I'm going to be doing this type of video for basketball, hockey, and baseball as well. But we're going to start off with football. The more points you allow, the more likely you are to lose. That's extremely obvious, right? The more times your quarterback gets sacked, the more likely you are to lose. Yeah, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. The point of this video is more to find out how many pass attempts is enough, how many points allowed is too many, how many sacks allowed is too many, stuff like that. What I did was I looked at every game from 2011 through 2019 and looked at the team's winning percentage when they give up 3 sacks or they pass for 400 yards and stuff like that. But yeah, let's jump into it, starting off with passing yards. Here are the passing yards and how it correlates to winning since 2011. In the red is the winning percentage. And what I did was I went in increments of 10 and found out the team's winning percentage when they pass for between 1 to 10 yards or between 161 yards to 170 yards and such. But on this slide, there is surprisingly not that much of a correlation between a bunch of passing yards and winning. I mean, when you pass for a lot of yards, like 450 plus yards, yeah, there's a pretty decent correlation between that and winning. But between 200 yards and 300 yards, it's almost stagnant. Now, of course, part of the reason that it could be stagnant is because when you're winning, you're not likely to be passing as much, versus when you're losing, you're likely to be passing a lot more. So this chart probably doesn't tell the whole story, but let's go over rushing yards now. On this slide, the winning percentage is in purple, and I went in increments of 5 on this portion of the video. Now, unlike passing, there is a huge correlation between rushing yards and winning. After you rush for 111 yards, there is not a single time where your winning percentage is less than 50%. But of course, this again probably doesn't tell the whole story, because when you're ahead, you're more likely to be handing the ball off, and when you're trailing, you're more likely to be airing it out. However, there's one game that I want to use as an example of how running the ball could be the difference between winning and losing. There was a game between the Miami Dolphins and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Dolphins lost 19-22. They had 2 yards rushing. It was a 1-possession game, and they had 2 yards rushing. If they maybe ran the ball much better, could they have maybe won the game? Well, we'll never know at this point, but when you can't run the ball in a close game, that's a big blow to your team. Another game that I think is a good example of how running the ball is important is a game between the Detroit Lions and the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Lions had just 14 yards rushing. The Lions did win the game 26-19, but that doesn't even come close to telling the whole story. They had just 14 yards rushing, but they also had 2 touchdowns that weren't on offense. They had a special teams touchdown and a defensive touchdown. So I guess what I'm getting at is it took the Lions having to score on special teams and defense just to overcome the fact that they rushed for only 14 yards. And it was a game that was a 1-possession game the whole time. No team ever got a 2-possession lead at any point in that game. So we talked about passing yards and rushing yards, but let's talk about pass attempts versus rush attempts now. On the pass attempts graph, the win percentage is in yellow, And on the rush attempts graph, the win percentage is in purple. On the pass attempts, since 2011, we can clearly see that there is a gradual decrease in your winning percentage the more you pass. And on the rush attempts graph, we can see that there's a gradual increase the more you run the ball. Now again, we come back to the whole thing that you're more likely to be passing when you're behind and you're more likely to be running when you're ahead, which is true. However, according to these graphs, it's definitely important to maintain balance throughout a game. One game in particular that was appalling was when the Detroit Lions played the Green Bay Packers in 2015 at Lambeau Field. Aaron Rodgers threw over 60 passes in a game where it was a one-possession game for a huge majority of it. And Aaron Rodgers still threw over 60 passes. That's not a winning formula. When you're in a close game, you should be balanced. It's important to be balanced, especially when it's a close game. Now, I want to talk about pass attempts real fast because here's another reason that might get overlooked about why your winning percentage begins to gradually decrease as you pass the ball more. A lot more things can go wrong on a passing play than on a running play. On a passing play, the more you pass, the more likely you are to throw an interception, get sacked, get strip sacked, or even once you pass the ball, the receiver can even fumble. So a lot more things can go wrong on a passing play than a running play. A lot more chunk plays come off of passing plays than running plays, but you're more likely to turn the ball over on a passing play than you are on a running play. So speaking of things that can go wrong on a passing play, let's take a look at the team's winning percentage when they are sacked a certain amount of times. I found every game in which teams gave up 0 sacks all the way to 9 sacks. When I got to 9 sacks, I just counted every game in which the team gave up 9 or more sacks, all in one column. The win percentage is in red. Now there is a pretty strong correlation between allowing sacks and losing. And on the flip side, there's a pretty strong correlation between getting sacks and winning. Once a team gives up more than 2 sacks, their win percentage is below 50% since 2011. And even when you give up 2 sacks, your win percentage goes down from 64.7 when you give up 1 sack, all the way down to 51.4% when you give up 2 sacks. Sacks are one of the most important things for winning, and keeping your quarterback from getting sacked is one of the most important things for winning as well. Now, this one might be a little bit random, but when you get a special teams or a defensive touchdown, your winning percentage is 69.9. That's it. Just 1 non-offensive touchdown. When you get 2 non-offensive touchdowns, your winning percentage is 87.5. And when you get 3 or more, your win percentage is 90%. Granted, getting 3 or more touchdowns from your defense and special teams is extremely rare, as I could only find 10 games in which this happened. But it definitely would make sense, considering that you get an entire drive's worth of plays all in one play from your defense or special teams. So that means your offense doesn't have to do nearly as much work. The next thing we're going to talk about is time of possession. The win percentage is in purple, and I went in increments of 1, starting with when a team possessed the ball for 16 or less minutes, all the way up to 16 to 16:59, to 17 to 17:59, etc. But as far as the importance of time of possession, it's very important to control the time of possession. This graph is almost in a completely straight line. Not entirely, but almost as close as you can get. Outside of the outlier, when teams possess the ball between 40 minutes and 40 minutes and 59 seconds, your winning percentage goes up with each second you have the football. It's actually extremely interesting to see really how simple the formula for winning is when it comes to football, especially when you look at time of possession. Next up, we got takeaways. Now, this portion of the video may be flawed for one reason in particular, and that's that this isn't turnover margin. This is just strictly takeaways. It doesn't take into account how often the opponent turned the ball over. But, of course, takeaways are important, as we can see. Your win percentage goes up in an even straighter line than it went up on time of possession. However, when teams get one takeaway, they still have a less than 50% winning percentage. You actually need 2 takeaways before you generally see a team have a winning percentage above 50%. And then when you get 6 or more takeaways, it's just almost a guaranteed win right there. But when we get to the end of the video, I will show you that takeaways are not a crutch in any way, shape, or form. If you see a team's defense living and dying off of forcing turnovers, you have reason to be nervous. Now, the last number we're going to go over is points allowed. And like I said at the beginning of the video, of course, the more takeaways you get, the more likely you are to win. The more sacks you get, the more likely you are to win. The more points you allow, the more likely you are to lose. But now I want to answer one of the biggest questions that I guess this video tried to answer, which is how many points allowed is too many? And surprisingly, the answer is not as high as I personally expected it to be. And that number is 22 points. Once a team gives up 22 points, they see a winning percentage below 50%. Now, there is just one outlier, though. When a team gives up 32 points, they actually have a winning percentage above 50%. But that is an outlier. The more points you give up, the more likely you are to lose. And the number that appears to be the number that you have to prevent from happening is 22 points. Because after that, every single point you allow means you have a less than 50% chance of winning. Again, unless you give up 32 points. But like I said, that is an outlier. And then your winning percentage when you give up 40 or more points is just 14%. So we've just gone over all of these stats and how they affect a team's record. However, there is not really a substitute for allowing points. On this little table, I have the winning percentages going from lowest to highest of how to compensate for your team giving up 22 or more points. And surprisingly, the best way to compensate for it is to run the ball. It sounds strange, but that's what the evidence suggests. The second best way to compensate for your defense giving up 22 or more points is to score on defense or score on special teams. And then the worst way to compensate for your defense giving up 22 or more points is to not run the ball, as when teams rush 26 or less times in a game, their winning percentage is only 13.9% when they give up 22 or more points. And surprisingly, the second worst way to compensate for your defense giving up 22 or more points is to throw more. As when teams throw 34 or more times, when their defense gives up 22 or more points, the win percentage is only 21.2%. But yeah, there's not really that much of a substitute for giving up points. But running the ball, scoring on defensive special teams, and getting takeaways is definitely the best way to compensate, but it is not adequate. Well, yeah, that'll be all for this video. Like I said, this is normally a Detroit sports channel for the most part, but I felt like making this video to better inform myself, I guess, and to maybe help give you, the viewer, a different perspective of how certain decisions or things or aspects of a team affects the game. But yeah, what do you guys think is the most important thing to winning? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.